Howdy, I'm Kate Kavanaugh, and you're listening to the Mind, Body, and Soil podcast, where we're laying the groundwork for our land, ourselves, and for generations to come by looking at the way every thread of life is connected to one another. Communities above ground mirror the communities below the soil, which mirror the vast community of the cosmos. As the saying goes, as above, so below. Join me as we take a curious journey into agriculture, biology, history, spirituality, health, and so much more. I can't wait to unearth all of these incredible topics alongside you. Hello and welcome to the Groundwork Podcast, formerly the Mind, Body, and Soil Podcast, where we explore the threads of what it means to be humans woven into this earth. I am your host, Kate Kavanaugh, and it is always such a pleasure to be here with you. This week, I have an incredible guest. Her name is Nicola Twilley, and her book, which is out next week on June 25th, is called Frostbite: How Refrigeration Changed Our Food, Our Planet, and Ourselves. She also has an incredible podcast called Gastropod, where she explores the history of all kinds of food. I especially enjoyed her last couple of episodes on shrimp and on oysters. I have been at the heart, in some ways, of the cold chain for over 12 years. And when I say the cold chain, I mean that I have worked as a butcher in the business of something that needs to be refrigerated. In fact, one of the things that I've repeated over the years is that many of the things that we love, and my job as a butcher has really been to just mitigate rot. That the second that an animal has been harvested or killed, it is in this process of deteriorating, as is every vegetable, as it is pulled out of the field. And refrigeration radically changed our world. And I really didn't have a concept of just how radical this shift was until I picked up Nikki's book. I honestly couldn't believe it. I'm still a little jaw on the floor, speechless to see just how much this has changed our world. And having just interviewed John Valiant and spoken a lot about fire, which humans domesticated around 1 million years ago, it was incredibly radical to think about the fact that humans really just domesticated refrigeration less than 150 years ago, really domesticating it just 100 years ago. And so that's our domestication of cold. And as I think about the history of how the food system has changed, which we've talked a lot about over the last 150 years, I feel like I have this huge blind spot in how refrigeration specifically had altered not just our food system, but the course of history and how we live our lives. And I can't help but go back to the idea that in 1851 in Chicago, the first futures commodity was traded. And somewhere in Australia that same year was a pretty big bid to mechanize refrigeration. And what has ensued, the history of our food system, of how it has been created, wouldn't have been possible without refrigeration. And prior to this, we really only had means of food preservation that required salt. Shout out to one of the sponsors of this week's episode, Redmond Real Salt. And we also had smoke. We had fire. And I mean, I really can't. I don't have words for how much this transforms it, how fascinating the history of this is. It is the history of us. It is the history of our food system. It is a big piece of that question of how did we get here? I want to read this one little piece of Nicola's where she says, quote, In short, our food system is frostbitten. It has been injured by its exposure to cold. Part of the reason for that is that refrigeration was implemented, for the most part, in order to optimize markets rather than human and environmental health. And in this case, Project Drawdown attributes a large number, I think it's somewhere around 10% of greenhouse gas emissions, to both cooling in terms of air conditioning as well as refrigeration. And I think that this is, as we have been guided by this David Graeber quote, that the ultimate hidden truth of our world is that it is something that we make and could just as easily make differently. This is an opportunity for us to make it differently. And Nikki's book really closes it out with some ideas of how people in Rwanda and all over the world might be reimagining the cold chain a little bit. I didn't get a chance to read this quote, but I really wanted to because it kind of boggled my mind. And it's it's about a cheeseburger and how maybe this food that we so often consume here in America over the summer really wouldn't exist prior to refrigeration. Nikki says, at this point, Jacques gave up. It wasn't the prospect of milling wheat or slaughtering cattle that put an end to his homemade cheeseburger plan. It was a scheduling conundrum. His tomatoes were in season in late summer, his lettuce ready to harvest in spring and fall. According to the pre-refrigeration agricultural calendar he was trying to follow, Jacques would have needed to make cheese in the springtime after his dairy cow had given birth, her calf could be slaughtered for the rennet, and the milk intended to feed it repurposed. Meanwhile, the steer would have traditionally been slaughtered in the autumn as soon as it started to get cold. If he turned the tomatoes into longer-lasting ketchup and aged his cheese in a cellar for 6 months until the meat, lettuce, and wheat bun were ready, he could maybe, possibly make a cheeseburger from scratch. But practically speaking, he concluded, the cheeseburger could not have existed until nearly a century ago. Nikki adds, as indeed it did not. Though there are a handful of competing origin stories, they all date to the 1920s and 30s. I think that this quote really illustrates how refrigeration has overcome our agricultural calendars and the seasons in which we grow food. As all of you will know that have been listening to the podcast, one of my thesis statements that I've been exploring is that we used to move our bodies to resources, and now we move resources to our bodies. And we've been exploring a lot of the infrastructure that underpins that, and refrigeration is a huge one. The point being that we could not have moved our bodies, or indeed even been in a more sedentary agricultural society, and made a cheeseburger. We require the advent of refrigeration to store these things. And as you'll hear Nikki talk about in this, usually in terms of the global market, their agricultural calendars have suppliers. And by that, I mean regions in the world that are 2 or 3 deep for each produce or food product that is going around. And so this includes things like blueberries, tomatoes, or bananas, which are, as it turns out, the most widely consumed fruit in the world. This has changed us. It has changed us fundamentally in ways that I think rival or at least compare to the changes that were wrought by the advent of agriculture some 12,000 years ago. That's how big I think this is. And Nikki explores it in Frostbite with a sense of playfulness and gravity both. She explores stories that are absolutely riveting with characters that will have you absolutely hooked on how refrigeration did change our food, our planet, and ourselves, our actual bodies. It is a tour de force, and I am telling you right now to pre-order this book so that it arrives on your doorstep on June 25th so that you can gobble it up. And then I want to get to work reimagining how we might use a little bit of less of this and tap into where we can and where we can afford it, our local food systems and local seasonal food, right? It's this idea that at the beginning of summer, I always see restaurant menus crop up with Three Sisters plantings, right? Corn, beans, and squash. And a lot of those things, especially for those of us in more northern climates, aren't really available until later in the summer, in the same way that the best tomatoes that you are going to eat in Colorado or New York or Vermont are probably coming to you in late August or early September and aren't actually the summer staple that we think of them as. I think Nikki's work that she is doing both with this book, with her essay writing, and on Gastropod is incredible. And I know she would love your support. She would love your listening ears. And I would love for you to support her. It is such a pleasure to really explore this, especially because I've joked over the years, over 12 years of owning a butcher shop, that I would have to give my firstborn child to my HVAC guy. And so a little shout out to Red at Able HVAC and to what it has been to work with cold all these years. A little bookkeeping, as it were. I want to thank our sponsors, Redmond Real Salt, which has such a really fun sort of complimentary story with this episode, as does Sundry's Farm Garlic, because most of our garlic has been in storage for 6 months or more that we buy at the grocery store. But Sundry's Farm Garlic is fresh from the farm with shipping beginning in September. And you can find links to those in the show notes. And if you enjoyed this episode, if you could just hit that subscribe button, and if you have time, leave a rating and review or share this episode with a friend. That's a big part of how this podcast finds new listening ears, and it's a free way to support my work. So without further ado, here is our episode with Nicola Twilley and her book, Frostbite, How Refrigeration Changed Our World, Our Planet, and Ourselves, which is out on June 25th. So you can pre-order it today and get it in your cold little paws next week. Here's Nikki. I'm so excited.
Thank you.
It's funny, as I was thinking about how to intro this, I recorded an episode with John Valiant on Friday. And so I've spent the last 3 months really looking at a lot of John's work through the lens of fire weather. And so I've spent a lot of time with ethylene oxide in a very different configuration. And I've spent a lot of time with fire. And so when I really sat down with Frostbite, I was struck by something that you said about the domestication of cold. And I actually wondered if we might open with that. And I have a little quote here from you to open and set this off, because this really struck me, especially in contrast with fire weather, where, we have the domestication of fire happening. Depends on who you ask, but let's call it about 1 million years ago. So prior to modern Homo sapien. And you have this fantastic little piece about refrigeration where you say, it is also a much more recent development. Our ancestors learned to control fire before modern humans ever evolved, but our ability to command cold at will dates back little more than 150 years. Mechanical cooling, refrigeration produced by human artifice, as opposed to the natural chill offered by weather-dependent snow and ice, wasn't achieved until the mid-1700s. It wasn't commercialized until the late 1800s, and it wasn't domesticated until the 1920s. And so I wonder if we might just start there.
Yeah, I have been researching and writing about cold and visiting cold storage warehouses and totally immersed in this world for more than a decade now. And I still get brought up short when I think about how recent a transformation this is for us. Because, I think, and this is a theory, but you will find anthropologists who argue that the control of fire is really what made us human. That
Absolutely.
By being able to cook food, we became the sort of big-brained, you can definitely question how well we use that brain and how, but
Yes.
that we became the big-brained creatures that we are, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, and the rest is history. But if you think about, that's adding heat. Adding heat transformed the course of human history. Taking heat away, that wasn't within our power until so recently. And as I wrote this book, I realized, oh, it too has transformed everything it's touched. So it's sort of it's the other side of the equation. It's incredibly recent, and yet it's equally transformative in a lot of ways.
I think it's incredibly transformative, and I was struck, I've worked in kitchens and I've spent a lot of time in walk-in coolers and dry aging meat. And so I felt like I had some lens on cold. I knew that everything that I love the most in this world is probably in some stage of rot, whether that's dry aged meat or cheese or wine or ferments or something like that. But I don't think I had considered just how much refrigeration and cooling changed the course of history, that it changed the way that globalization has played out, that it has changed the geography of our cities and the way that we build ourselves, that it has changed our health, just about everything. And I'm sure you can speak to this better, having spent the last 10 years in the cold.
It was it actually became sort of almost whack-a-mole toward the end, where I was like, oh God, not another thing that refrigeration has changed. Now I have to work this. Because I'd be talking to someone. This is totally random, but my husband is working on a new book as well, and we were visiting a guy he was interviewing, and the guy's wife was like, well, also an archaeologist, was like, well, I'm sure you know that, refrigeration transformed the North York moors, and this landscape that was it's made famous in the sort of the Brontes and Wuthering Heights and this kind of very romantic heather covered moor. And people, it's beautiful landscape. Many people visit and hike it to today. It's also very close to my heart because I went to university near there. But this landscape is a totally recent creation and a creation of refrigeration. And this is just another, the tiniest of examples. But until it became feasible to ship meat across oceans, a country like Britain had to feed its people on meat that was grown in Britain. And that meant you had to use land that wasn't very productive, like the moors, but that you grazed sheep there, and then sold them to the people who lived in the cities and worked in the factories. And they didn't get very much meat, and it wasn't, and it was quite expensive. And being able to open up, the Australia, New Zealand, and the sheep grazing there, the cattle grazing lands of South America, and bring that meat to this tiny little island where most of the people lived in cities. Suddenly, there was no point grazing animals on these kind of more marginal lands instead. And what you get is those people going out of business. You actually get mass migration. So this is the point at which a lot of, say, Scottish crofters, who have these tiny little, their flocks of sheep in this kind of tough landscape, give up for good and emigrate to the US or the Antipodes. And so that's one outcome of this. The other is that, okay, suddenly the North York moors don't have a grazing purpose anymore. And instead, the animals aren't cropping the landscape. Instead, the heather grows up and is deliberately encouraged because the land is now a leisure area for and heather is where grouse like to nest. And so an aristocrat, a landowner, can go and shoot some grouse on this landscape that becomes celebrated in poetry and literature, but used to be a meat growing landscape until we outsourced the meat growing landscape. And so it's just that it's that's a very long story to illustrate sort of a small, very tiny ripple of the larger ripple that is refrigeration. But it also gives you a sense of I'd be having dinner with someone and I'd say, oh, da, 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 da. And they'd say, oh, yeah, you have the North York Moors. And I'd be like, oh, my goodness, of course, this whole story. So it became this. I mean, I have been working on it for a long time. And it just became this ever expanding puzzle.
What do sauerkraut, lox, cured meats, miso, certain cheeses, and pickles have in common? Other than, of course, being delicious. They've all been cured by salt. If you're enjoying this interview with Nicola Twilley and her new book, Frostbite, How Refrigeration Changed Our Food, Our Planet, and Ourselves, then you will love this week's sponsor, Redmond Real Salt. Before the very recent advent of refrigeration, just over 100 years ago, we preserved food with smoke and salt. Mark Kurlansky, in his book Salt, writes, quote, "We have forgotten that from the beginning of civilization until about 100 years ago, salt was one of the most sought-after commodities in human history. That's because it is what allowed food to survive winter, traveling, and also trade. I still cure foods in my kitchen, using salt to preserve the abundance of summer. Things like herbs mixed with salt and herbes salé. I make sauerkrauts and ferments, and cure egg yolks at their peak of flavor to be grated over tasty broths later in the season when short days limit the number and flavor of my eggs. Salt is still an alternative to refrigeration and can also be a helpful part of the team to reduce food waste. Kimchi made from the stalks and leaves of cauliflower that normally get thrown in the trash? Count me in. I love using Redmond Real Salt for all my cooking and curing needs. The different size of salts, from fine to coarse, make it easy to use for a variety of application. It has unparalleled flavor, adding a touch of sweetness and earth to dishes with its 60 plus minerals. I also love that it is mine to table from an ancient seabed in Utah, a seabed formed before pollutants and microplastics of today. The best part? You can get 15% off Redmond Real Salt products using the code MindBodySoil_15 for 15% off Redmond Real Salt products by going to redmond.life. Again, that's the code MindBodySoil_15 for 15% off when you go to redmond.life or hit the link in the show notes. And I have to say, you navigate it beautifully, because there are all these small stories that crop up that cover every corner of the globe. That this is the third pole, our quest for cold, and so you navigate it beautifully. And you said a word in there that I actually want to tease at, since you brought it up, which is migration. And I was really struck in the book at how much. I think about what you just said, and I also think about the Industrial Revolution and the enclosure of the commons in the UK, and sort of how that rebalanced our urban and rural environment, which is a big piece of the book, but it's also a compression of time and space, right? That you talk about the food on its last migration, these salmon as they travel in cold storage, or these fruits and vegetables as they travel from far corners of the world. That migration is a piece of how cold has changed our geography and the way that our world works.
I'm so glad that resonated with you, because refrigeration, I began to see it's a time machine on
Yes.
one level. So it delays rot and decay. It sort of it doesn't stop time, but it slows time enough. And so that is one sort of time distortion effect. But it also then gives you this geographic distortion. So you're both shifting the seasons, but also allowing food to move across that space. So moving within space and time.
Mm-hmm.
And because I think you're completely right to sort of point out the other side of that is, because our food can now move across space and time, Well, other things have had to rearrange around that. And one of those things is people moving to
Yes.
cities. Um, it's a really, and this is another really interesting thing because until the 1800s, there really wasn't a city. I mean, this is the thing that is hotly debated amongst archaeologists, and no one really knows because it's not like anyone was doing great censuses of, ancient Chinese cities. But the 1800s is where London became the largest city that the world had ever seen. Um, and the thing about that is feeding a city is a problem unless you have refrigeration because you literally just can't get enough. And this is something you've talked about on the show before. People used to go to the food.
Yep.
Now you're trying to you can't have enough food for the people in the place where the people are. And people, believe me, they tried. I mean, that's one of the amazing things in the book too. There used to be entire herds of cattle stored
Turkeys.
underneath the Strand in London.
Yeah.
There used to be flocks of turkeys. Imagine driving a turkey. I mean, it sounds like,
I
a
can
ridiculous
to an extent. Having raised turkeys, I can going 1 mile per hour for over dozens of miles to get to the city. Unimaginable.
I mean, it's just the most beautiful description that I quote in the book is this. They're trying to drive a flock of turkeys into Philadelphia where the people are, and the food isn't. And nightfall comes, the turkeys all are trying to fly up in the trees to roost because they're birds.
That's what they do.
They don't realize they're meat. And they still think they're birds. And people, the workers are chasing them. They're moving at absolutely slower than walking speed. And that is how food had to be brought. Meat, especially on its own 2 legs or 4 legs. Or, there were pigs in Central Park. There were flocks of pigs in Kensington, which, if you know London at all, that's the ritziest part of town. There were herds of cattle underneath the Strand in London. People were trying however they could to get the food to where the people were, and it wasn't working.
Yeah.
And so that's really where refrigeration steps in, is at this breaking point where cities have become so large that there's no way to not address this problem anymore. You also have another thing going on, which is that at the time, the field of chemistry was this new thing, and chemists they thought, figured out that protein was the essential nutrient, that carbohydrate was, I guess that the frosting on the cake, it did nothing. They hadn't discovered vitamins yet. They had the other things were all, but protein was it. It both, made you strong and gave you the energy to do the work you needed to do in the factories. That's what people thought at the time. It was a mistake. But so they have all these workers. They have this crisis of bringing them protein.
Yeah.
And it was seen genuinely as a crisis. So there's, committees of the finest minds of the time set up to, what shall we do? The great food question of our time. And so that's a sort of forgotten problem, but that's where this all comes from.
Yeah, and I believe at the time too, you're seeing a lot of nutrient deficiencies, especially if we look through the lens of the enclosure of the commons, people are going from collectively growing their food, from access to some of this more nutrient density into the cities and into impoverished conditions where food was less accessible and nutrients, the vitamins that we hadn't yet defined, weren't really flowing. And so nutrient deficiency was an issue as well.
Yeah, again, it's almost impossible to reconstruct historic diets. It's really hard. But from the best we can see, there was urbanization was just a gigantic downhill at first for folks. It really was bad in every possible way for their health. And you can see why. Also, at the time, you have a big influx in the 1800s, you start getting huge influx of sugar, and people are using that for their calories, which you can imagine is not a super healthy replacement for the maybe limited, maybe a bland diet they were getting before. But, and people say, oh, it's so boring, so bland. Yes, there would have been a lot of barley and a lot of sturdy grains. But one of the things I look at in the book is that our methods of food preservation for a pre-refrigeration cuisine, they're the flavor bombs. It's all the
Yes.
fermented and dried and smoked and pickled things that have these incredible flavors. So even in small quantities, they're what's kind of uplifting your starchy, beans and grains and so on. So there is this flavor of pre-refrigeration cuisine that is built on those preservation methods. It's just that the chemists at the time were really concerned about meat, and they were right to be. People weren't getting a lot of meat, and it's not like they were getting like complete proteins, and there was a lentil revolution happening either. So they were right to be concerned. Their scientific diagnosis, which is that basically everyone needed a lot more meat, wasn't exactly um, the ideal solution, we now know. but they were correct to be concerned.
Did you know that most of the garlic that you buy at the grocery store is at least 6 months old and has been stored in refrigeration, deteriorating in quality for that whole time? This year, consider buying your culinary and seed garlic fresh. Beginning shipping in September, Sundry's Farm's soft and hardneck varietals are hand-grown in the Hagerman Valley of Idaho by the loving hands of Rob Kropfel and Jillian Lakuski. Certified white rot free and grown with incredible soil management practices and without the use of herbicides and pesticides, their softneck varietals like Nootka Rose and Laura's Italian will store outside of refrigeration in a cool and dry climate to last your kitchen garlic and seed garlic needs through winter. Their hardneck varietals like Persian Star and Chesnock Red will add incredible big cloves and big flavor to your kitchen in the late fall or early winter and plant well in your garden. Explore a wide range of varietals and grab bags for both hard and soft-necked and mixed for planting and culinary needs both by going to sundriesfarm.com. That's SUNDRIESFARM.com to pre-order seed and culinary garlic for the year with shipping beginning in September. There's no code necessary, just head to sundriesfarm.com. Let's get back to our episode with Nicola Twilley talking about refrigeration. Yeah, absolutely. I mean, the confluence of events that's happening as this domestication of cold comes online it's a really fascinating space because globalization is really taking off and industrialization is happening on a new and different level. And I think that this moment where it's a new moment of, as I was reading the book, I actually thought that the advent of cold storage, of the cold chain, had a lot in common with the advent of agriculture in a lot of ways and wrought some of the same problems as I think agriculture sort of introduced 10, 12,000 years ago, and even had some of the same players. And you mentioned this in the book that, agriculturally, maybe at first we wanted to brew beer, we wanted to grow grain to brew beer, and some people have sort of speculated about this. And it's really the loggers that sort of help fund and push forward some of the cold storage. But there's also...
I was amazed that like beer is always right there at the front.
Always beer.
It's always beer. I mean, there's something so relatable about humans. It's
throughout time too. But there's also the need to store stuff closer to us. Again, that idea that you mentioned that I keep coming back to in all of this work, which is we used to move our bodies to resources. Now we move our resources to our bodies. And there's so many externalities associated with that. And in that same way, cold allowed us to move even more to our bodies at an even faster pace.
And I love this way of thinking about it because it's so interesting to me, because you can see why this was picked up as a great solution, although interestingly not at first. And that was also something that I was genuinely fascinated by. All these, like I talked about the sort of greatest minds of the era sort of considering this pressing food question, how to get more protein into the workers in the cities. And refrigeration was seen as the least promising solution of all. People just were like, obviously, it's not that they didn't know that cold would stop rot or at least delay rot. They knew. They were perfectly aware. It's just that it didn't seem like a feasible mass solution. So they were into things like injections and fumigation and coatings. And there were various processes developed to sort of compress meat into these tiny little pellets and biscuits and even shreddies that you would sort of rehydrate. So vast amounts of ingenuity, thousands of patented processes, people really trying to crack this, and all of them thinking that, there's no point. And the reason, there's no point even trying cold. And the reason they thought that is because we didn't have control of it. It wasn't something that operated at scale. So for most of human history, people have noticed colds. If they lived in a place where there was any natural cold, they would have noticed its preservative powers. It's just that those are, you could extend the time span that you could hold on to that cold using an ice house, and rich people did, but it's not a global mass scale solution at all. And the journey, and it wasn't clear to people that it could become that. And the first inkling that it could become that actually came from natural ice and a high school dropout in Boston who managed to turn natural ice into a global industry. And this was another thing that blew my mind. The way we think about Saudi oil today, like here is this is a kingdom that has risen atop this subterranean resource that has just made them incredibly rich. Well, New England was that because it had so many frozen ponds.
So much ice.
So much. People were like, oh, America is blessed with this icy resource, this richness that you wouldn't get, say, even in the UK. It's too mild a climate. And so this guy who is an amazing character and again so relatable in his diaries. I mean, he's this weird mix of completely overconfident. He writes these kind of snotty letters to people being like, yeah, if you don't get on board now, you're going to regret this. We will have riches beyond our dreams. Nothing can stop us. And then being surprised when everyone is like, no, thanks. You're going to ship cubes of ice around the globe? I don't think so. And he has this ridiculous inability to plan. So he brings a boatload of ice to, Cuba and hasn't thought about where to store it or what to do. He hasn't even thought about the fact that when the ice is harvested, the Boston Harbor is going to be frozen over. So what's he going to do? He can't sail a ship out of town when literally, I mean, I actually, the whole way through, I was like, yeah, I would have made that mistake too. I was so relatable, but also just such an idiot. And he keeps writing he's chased by creditors. He's writing the word panic in block cap or anxiety in block caps in his journals repeatedly. Very relatable, but manages to do it and turn this thing that people thought was just a sort of niche way of keeping food cold for the rich, for luxuries. People use that ice, honestly, just for, having a wine slushie in summer as a treat. The elite did. They didn't use it for storing food. You couldn't use it for storing food. It just didn't operate at that scale. And he was the one who demonstrated if you can supply a city with ice at this kind of scale, you could transform the food system. And that is sort of what sowed the seed of artificial refrigeration, mechanical refrigeration, sort of viability in people's mind.
It's an incredible story. His name was Tudor, right? Do I have that right?
Yeah, Frederick Tudor, yes.
Frederick Tudor. And it's an incredible story and such a wild one to imagine shipping ice. And I know that you got to go see ice being harvested, which is incredible.
I got to harvest it myself. It is a workout.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, it's a good workout. I was thinking too, in this, and I was looking for the quote, but you talk about, ultimately a lot of this ended up not being about human health or about anything about the environment, but it ended up being about markets. And I
Oh,
think
yeah.
Frederick Tudor's story really exemplifies that early capitalization of the cold chain too.
Oh, totally. And the economics of why it succeeded are fascinating. I mean, part of it is that no one could figure out how to tax it. It wasn't seen as agriculture, even though it was sort of harvested, and it wasn't seen as mining, because even though it was sort of a sort of resource that was also taken. So no one knew what it wasn't. An article of manufacture because humans hadn't made it. So, no idea how to tax it. So, it was tax free. And so like these weird economic reasons. The other thing is that ships leaving from Boston often didn't have a lot to bring with them. It wasn't a place that was creating a lot of bulk items for export. And so ships would sail using rocks as ballast because you have to have
Yeah.
something in the hold.
Yeah.
And so once they could be convinced that this ice wasn't going to all melt and, set their ship like all kind of,
Topsy-turvy.
higgledy-piggledy.
I don't
Exactly. Once they believed that it wasn't gonna be a total disaster, well, then, yeah, sure, we'll carry your ice for a discounted rate because we were just gonna be carrying rocks. And meanwhile, the ice itself is free. It's a pond. You're just
Yeah.
taking off that. So, actually, the economics of it are weirdly advantageous. And so it's just one of those weird, and as you say, that throughout there's sort of these moments where it's not maybe something you could have predicted, but then the market makes it happen. And I do think that it's one of the reasons why I really think this book is important is because refrigeration, it's not good or bad. It's just that we have implemented it as a market solution and
Yes.
we haven't looked at its impacts. And
Yes.
some of those impacts are good and some of them are bad. And it's within our powers to say, well, we don't like the bad impacts. So we can structure our markets and the economy and regulations so as to avoid them. And so, of course, all the people who innovated in this space were in the market. They were, people trying to sell meat from Chicago in New York. They were people, trying to ship ice around from New England to Calcutta. They were people who were trying, to ship lettuce from California to the East Coast. People who wanted to make money solved the problems of refrigeration and implemented the solutions. And they did not do it because that was not their job. They did not do it in pursuit of health or in pursuit of environmental sustainability or even in pursuit of deliciousness in the food.
No.
They did it in pursuit of solving their market problem.
Yeah.
And that's just that gets you to a different set of problems.
It does. And I think this is actually a really good place because I wanted to bring up something that isn't in the book, but it kept coming to mind to me. So and I'll define this, but do you know what Jevons paradox is?
Oh, I have heard that, but define it. Yes.
Let's define it.
Yeah.
So when the cost of using a resource decreases due to increased efficiency, it becomes more attractive for consumers and industries to utilize it. Consequently, this increased affordability leads to higher consumption and can potentially offset the initial gains in efficiency. And while refrigeration doesn't fit this bill in like a really neat and tidy way, I kept coming back to this idea, especially as you talk about the comparative advantage of the way some certain breeds of vegetables were selected for cold storage, but also the way that food waste begins to take off in light of refrigeration and the way in which refrigeration is used both on an individual scale at a home refrigerator and within a more regional scale in a refrigerated distribution center, and then again on sort of a global scale as we ship these bananas and salmon and cherries hither and yon. And so I just kind of wanted to bring that into play because of the economics of this and the way that it created commodities too, in terms of FCOG. I was just excited to use that.
FCOG, indeed. It is so okay. So there's so many. There's so many sort of moments that fit within that. One of the things I think about first is apples. So apples were one of the early kind of pioneers in figuring out how to store fruit in cold storage. A lot of this work, the pioneering work, was carried out at a place called the Low Temperature Research Station in Cambridge, in England, and it came out of actually the First World War, where England, again, tiny, very urbanized nation, and the German U-boats are sinking a lot of ships, and that. And the UK quickly realizes it's going to starve, and it doesn't. It's dependent on the steady flow of imported food, and it can't keep that food stored. And so there's this sort of impetus to figure out this problem. Low Temperature Research Station is set up, and they get to work on the problem of apples, sort of staple fruit in the UK, but difficult to store in the cold. Some of them store well for a while, but they're susceptible to a lot of different sort of diseases of aging. And they all have incredible names like brown heart, and so they get to work on this. One of the things that is interesting about fruit and vegetables and trying to store them is what you're doing is you're slowing down how fast they're breathing, essentially, how fast they're respiring. So every fruit and vegetable has a certain number of breaths it can take until it's going to kick it once it's off the plant. And you are just trying to slow that down. And cold does that. But also what the scientists there found, and I tell this story, I went into the archives, which looked like no one had ever touched them. Just boxes full of
that's
notes
kind of fun.
and dose. It was amazing.
Yeah.
But what they discovered was that if you change the blend of gases, oxygen and carbon dioxide, and nitrogen, so give them a slightly different atmospheric blend of air to breathe in, you can slow it down even further. And so that led to the development of what's called controlled atmosphere storage for apples. And that led to a situation where, we're recording this in May. You can go into any store and there are fresh apples, and there will be fresh apples in June. There will be fresh apples in July. Your apple could happily be a year old at this point, and it will have been stored in controlled atmosphere. And what that led to was a huge boom in apple production and Washington State becoming a giant orchard. And now they're at the point, so this was seen to be a huge economic boon to them. Great. We have this huge harvest. We can store it. We can sell it over the course of the year. What farmer is not happy? But then you have so many people planting apple trees and getting into this business that now an apple, it can hardly sell for the price of growing it plus storage. And the huge harvest has to be shipped overseas. And as you say, it's become a commodity. And once you compete on price, that's all you have. And now it's got to the point where new apples are being branded, and there are influencers hired to launch them. The apple I talk about yeah, exactly. They hired astronauts to promote this apple in an attempt to make it not a commodity again. And so it's almost full circle. Here's an apple that admittedly stores really well. It's been selected so it can store really well. But the only way to make it stand out in the marketplace is to create a brand around it. And and use marketing money to do that. And it's just incredible that this solution that was going to, embraced by apple growers as this huge boon economically has, in the end, just turned an apple into a widget when you have a widget, the only differentiating factor is price.
Yeah.
And so now they have to spend money on marketing their widgets and giving them a brand. And for any economist, I think, okay, it's like, oh, we could have probably seen this coming, but it happens again and again
Yeah.
in these stories, and it's sort of yeah, there used to be, as anyone who loves apples and goes to farmers markets knows, there used to be hundreds of varieties of apples, thousands, and, some of them were the early ones, and some of them were the ones that stored well, and some of them were the ones that were good for pies, and some of them the ones good for eating out of the hand, and you would know which apple you wanted for and, I mean, I hate to say it, those were brands. They just didn't have influencers promoting
Yeah.
them, but they had their own unique selling point that now
Yes.
people are trying to create artificially around this cosmic crisp. It's a full yeah. Anyway, it's a sort of astonishing to me how sort of that promise of refrigeration to oh, like, here's a way we're all gonna make more money by being able to sell our apples year round. It didn't deliver because it just over delivered thousands of apples at all times that now the
Yeah.
only thing that sets them apart is there is price.
Yeah. Yeah. And that it wasn't the boon for farmers either that they expected.
No.
And I think that something that you're
And farmers
speaking.
really struggle to make money on this now.
Oh,
It's a
yeah.
huge issue. Yeah.
Oh, yeah. I mean, you have an United States average margin for a farmer is 2.4%. And you talk in the book, there was a piece that I didn't know that, 3% of the farms in America make 97% of the food at 4 times the profit as the other 97% that are struggling. And I think that this actually falls into what I was going to tug on next, which is I think the book speaks to biodiversity loss on so many different levels and layers. I mean, it is both the biodiversity of the types, the species of these fruits and vegetables that we're eating, but it's also kind of a diversity loss of our own ability to taste flavor. I kept coming back
Oh,
to
yeah.
that idea, this shifting baseline of how we perceive flavor, a loss of our own microbial diversity inside of our gut and other aspects of our health. It is also, I mean, just the loss of cooking and preserving traditions of that biodiversity that's unique to different regions around the globe.
Yeah.
And it's just a homogenizing and monocropping. And I kept coming back to it's sort of a standardizing and a flavorification of foods, that it's just these single flavors.
I mean, the orange juice is the perfect example there,
Yes.
actually. FCOJ, which we should say is frozen concentrated orange juice. And NFC is the one you'll see most often on shelves these days. That's not from concentrates. So that's things like your Tropicana and Minute Maid. But
Mm.
FCOJ came first. Um, and there's a whole section in the book where I get into this and like how that was developed. And, Bing Crosby is the guy who sold it to Americans and so on. But, it was a wartime thing. That they were trying to use vacuum technology to dehydrate hamburger. It wasn't going very well. They switched to orange juice. That wasn't going very well. Orange juice, anyone who's had it freshly squeezed knows it's very ephemeral, right? I mean,
Mhm.
and that's another thing that you keep. It's just the cognitive dissonance of the fact that we can go to a store and get fresh. I'm
Fresh,
putting quote
big quotes.
orange juice all year round, every day, and yet we know that orange juice isn't like that. We know, or maybe we don't anymore. But if you think about it for 5 seconds, you do know it. Anyway, long story short, the process that is developed to turn orange juice from this very ephemeral, seasonal, local treat into something that all of us can have all year round at any moment we so desire is a process that involves stripping out all the flavor molecules
Mhm.
because you can't store them. They oxidize, they turn bad. So there's this sort of vacuum technology. It strips out every single sort of all the volatiles they're called. that's the stuff that makes it taste like an
Mhm.
orange.
Mhm.
Otherwise, it's sugar water. And that is what you get at the end of it. You get sort of this brownish, sugary slush. For F-Codge, they then concentrate it, so they get rid of the water, and then it's very viscous. It's almost like a molasses. It has a tendency to crystallize and gunk things up. And what you do then is when you're repackaging it for the consumer, you add back the water and you add back the flavor molecules. You don't have to say it has added flavors because the molecules are all ones that are found in oranges. You don't add anything from a raspberry, say. So they're all found in oranges. So you don't have to say it's added flavor. You just add it back, but you don't have to add it back in the ratio it came out.
Yeah.
And so now you have a situation. I'm lucky. I live in Los Angeles and I have a backyard orange tree. And so I know the orange juice I make in February tastes very different from the orange juice I make in April from that tree, because the oranges have been on the tree a little longer and they're a little sweeter. And that's, I can taste the difference from the oranges from the front side of the tree that gets the sun and the back side of the tree that doesn't. And that's just my tree, let alone different trees, different varieties of orange that come in over the course of the seasons. They all taste different. No, with this new F-Codge, what you do is you add back the flavors, but you add it back in the same ratio every time. And the result does taste like orange, but it doesn't even need to taste like, it doesn't taste like an orange. It tastes like orange. It generically, it might be an orange that has never been found in nature in that particular ratio, but it is the brand flavor of, say, Minute Maid. And now you can build a brand around it because it's going to taste the same every time. And people they can say, oh, I like Tropicana. I don't like Minute Maid, because they like the kind of more puckery taste of a Tropicana versus the more kind of floral notes of a Minute Maid, more candy type. And that's, then
So
it's not
wild.
surprising that, oh, well, I think it's Coca-Cola owns, does it Coca-Cola
Minute
owns
Maid.
Tropicana or vice versa, and Pepsi owns the other one.
Yeah.
And then it's not surprising because it's like, yeah, they're competing on a branded sugar water with flavors. It just, that's what that product has become, and it will taste the same every time. And it's just this, and that's how you do it. And it, as you sort of said, that loss, it's not like, oh gosh, everyone has an orange tree in their backyard and everyone is missing out on this. Most people don't know, and most people wouldn't have been able to have orange juice in the past. But it is kind of an astonishing loss otherwise. And there's an amazing moment in the book where there's this editorial after there's a cold storage banquet held to sort of convince people that the cold stored food is safe back in 1911. And it's an amazing moment. But the editorial afterwards is like, this one newspaper is like, well, fortunately, people in the future probably won't know what they're missing out on. I really feel like that's true. We don't.
Yeah. Well, I mean, I came back to this because then we select different breeds for their ability to withstand refrigeration. You do a beautiful job of this, exploring it through the lens of a tomato. I mean, we lose apples, we lose oranges, but we also lose that phytochemical richness. Come back to, are you familiar with the work of like Stefan Van Vliet or Fred Provenza?
Fred Provenza, yeah.
Yeah, Fred's a friend of mine, and looking at the way that we select not primary compounds in terms of vitamins or minerals or carbohydrates and protein, but secondary compounds, which are these phytochemicals that we associate, the anthocyanins in blueberries or the terpenes in hemp and various things, or the tannins in wine. And there's a whole dark matter of these secondary compounds, and they're very responsive to these slight things, how much sun, which side of the tree that orange is on. And they actually do make up something that I think we don't yet fully understand about nutrition and about flavor and about our draw to certain foods. And so we're losing species, and we're also losing our ability to select and to taste these things.
There's two things that I think are really important there. One is that when you have a supermarket peach, which tastes like crap, because it cannot help but taste like that, because all of the pathways that produce flavor in a peach are switched off when it is stored below a certain temperature. And it just there's just no way it's going to taste of anything. It's just like you could do your best, but it isn't. So is it surprising that people don't choose a peach and they choose a gummy candy instead, because the gummy candy tastes of something? And so I do think there's a huge and there's a section of the book where I tried to tease out the health impact of refrigeration, and it's a really hard question to answer, but that I think is a big unanswered one, is just how that loss of flavor has made things that should be so appealing. A ripe peach should be the thing you want to eat, and it isn't. You'd
and
rather have an ice.
joyful.
Yeah,
And I
joyful.
actually have to just add that, like, just the joy. There is nothing more. I grew up in Colorado, and Palisade peaches are amazing. There's nothing more joyful than that.
It's and you get this in places where it still happens. I mean, I remember I have a podcast called Gastropod, and we made an episode about mangoes, and we interviewed this guy in Delhi, and he said every year at mango season, he just rents a bus for him and his friends, and they go out and they cram their faces full of mangoes, and the juice is running down them, and it is all over their hands, and they like stick to each other on the way home because they're so covered in mango. But it's just this incredible celebration of mango perfection, and it's there's nothing craveable about a supermarket mango. It just isn't doing that for you. You might have it because you think it's a healthy choice, but like that requires discipline, and not sort of unbridled joy, like you say. So that's on the one hand, and then on the other, this is something that astonished me with the tomato research. In the book, I tell the story of this guy who was sort of determined to create a tomato that tasted of something and could be refrigerated. So he's not trying to, say, no, we should only eat backyard tomatoes, which, you can't go wrong with a backyard tomato. But
It's true.
But he's saying, like, this is the world we live in. We have a refrigerated supply chain. Let me breed a tomato that tastes of something that works in that supply chain. And there are a whole series of problems to be overcome to do with, again, the fact that, like, a tomato, the mechanism for producing flavor just switches off at certain temperatures, and there's issues around ripening. There's issues around how do you ship, or you can't ship a ripe tomato, it's too squishy. So they have to harvest them while they're green and hard, and then gas them with ethylene, which is a plant hormone. That gas them always sounds bad, so I'm just like, it's a plant hormone. They're ripening them. That's a different process from ripening on the vine.
Yeah.
It also impacts the flavor, etc. Anyway, he's dedicated his career to this. He's very close to success. I've tasted his tomatoes. They're incredible, and they do stand up to the cold chain. But one of the most fascinating things he discovered along the way is that the best tasting tomatoes are also the highest in these phytonutrients. And it implies that the things we like the flavor of are really good for us.
Yeah.
And we've bred those out of tomatoes, and that one would assume would have a negative impact on our health. And you said this, we don't know yet the science around phytonutrients. There is no RDA for them because no one knows how much we need and how much we should have and what they're, all the things they're doing. But to me, we do know that there are health effects. We do know that that is what we prefer. And listen, our entire sensory apparatus is set up to help us survive on the planet.
Yes.
That's why we have it. And so it is not surprising to me that things that taste good would be good for us.
And it co-evolved with those things.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So that was amazing to me. He was like, "Oh, here was an interesting thing we discovered," and I was like, "Well, of course,
just a little thing." I loved that bit, and I loved how his career trajectory kind of came back all the way to making a more flavorful tomato. And I'll say this for listeners, the work that Dan Kittredge is doing at the Bionutrient Institute, off of some of Fred's work and Stefan's work, is really interesting, looking looking at some of these things.
I
But
mean,
I kept,
breeding for flavor is so vanishingly rare that it
yeah,
has to be celebrated. And
it must be.
also, I just don't think that people realize, like, that's not what their fruit and vegetables are bred for. They're
Nope.
bred to fit for yield, yes, and also for supply chain sturdiness.
Yep.
And that has been a very, and so they're bred for refrigeration, and that
Yeah.
has not been a good thing.
And I mean, it's the same with animals. We've bred animals into a frenzy, which I won't get into. But I did keep coming back to this idea, right? We've taken in so many different ways, and I think about this in a lot of different areas. But I think the cold chain exemplifies it. We've taken the sine wave of nature, where you have these peaks and troughs, you have winter and summer, and we've flatlined it. We have created eternal summer in its abundance, eternal winter in the cold chain, and something that you don't specifically touch on this completely in the book, but I kept thinking about this delay of death that we are participating in. And I think about that a lot in our culture, that growth in perpetuity is this denial of death. And you have this great little piece here about it's with Erwin Goldman. If you wouldn't mind me reading it, because I really did like, this is so much about denying death. He says, "It's amazing any of this stuff works, really." Erwin Goldman, a vegetable breeder at the University of Wisconsin, told me. He thinks to vegetable should be a verb, one that describes how humans have manipulated their favorite edible plants to become the horticultural equivalent of Dorian Gray. To Goldman, the verb phrase to vegetable encompasses the way in which humans take a plant and breed it so it can be harvested when it's super immature, so that it's tender and lovely and we want to eat it, but also how we then reverse engineer its metabolism so that the twilight years of that harvested fruit or leaf will extend indefinitely.
I love Irwin. He's so okay. First of all, everyone should know Irwin is has bred the best beets on the planet. He's a beet and carrot specialist, and his Badger Flame beets, you can buy them through Row 7 Seeds, are the world's most delicious beets. Also, he's the nicest man in the world. And the reason we even had this conversation, I wasn't interviewing him. I was asking him to get me academic papers that I didn't have access to because I don't have university library access. And he was just
Yeah.
funneling me all these papers. And we were talking about things because he is a lovely human being. And he said this, and I just had to include it in the book. And I think it's so true. I think the other thing to do that you're saying is it's sort of this perpetual growth, denial of death, also just unwillingness to sit with change and
Mhm.
fluctuation. And one of the things that
Yeah.
actually an avocado guy explained to me was, it's called filling the calendar. They have to find sort of these, so when the California avocados aren't in season, they have a range of sort of California stand-in landscapes that will deliver the same avocado um, for the different spots in the calendar, and so that the the supermarket shelf looks the same all year round, but is being filled in by these sort of alternate Californias that are scattered around the globe, and you need to have at least two of them, hopefully three, to avoid any supply chain disruptions. Because God forbid you go to the store and you can't get the thing you want, and
Yeah.
that's just not acceptable. You can't not be on the shelf, because you don't just lose that sale; you lose sort of, uh, you know mind space in the consumer. You're no longer to be trusted. You're no
Yeah.
longer sort of a reliable vegetable. And that's just a weird way to think about something that's alive and has seasons.
Yeah.
And I think, this happened came up a lot in my conversations. You know, growers and vegetable breeders, they're very, and supermarket logistics folks, they are pragmatic people, and they are responding to what people want. But and they say that all the time. People want this. People don't. People don't want to eat seasonally. People don't want their strawberries to change flavor over the course of the season. They want the same thing there all the time at the same price. And I do believe that people do express that desire in their shopping. People are lazy. People want to do the least possible amount of work. I count myself amongst people there. But
Me
at the
too.
same time, I don't think that I don't think you have to give them that. Maybe you do for sales reasons, but I think it's an underestimation of what people are capable of
Me
if
too.
you push them a little. I just think just because we are all lazy and an easy solution is great, and not having to recalibrate once you're already at the market because something's out of season and now you have to buy something else. I get it. But at the same time, I think we are an ingenious
Yeah.
species. We could do a little better here.
And, I don't even know if I think of it as lazy as much as I think of it as the idea that we've been inculcated in this standard that we show up at the grocery store and we expect there to be this variety, at least in the global north and the Western world, depending on how you look at it, probably just the Western world at this point. And so I think that's our expectation. And we've been raised that way with all of these things and abundance and this expectation that it will always be there, but we have an opportunity to sort of reimagine these things and to kind of begin to wrap up. So respecting your time here, you do start to maybe wonder what it would look like to reimagine it, because while a cold boom is actually resurging in America, which I thought was interesting, you have what Bill Lawrence calls the infrastructural tsunami that's happening in the global south. And this really includes the cold chain. And I want to give you two pieces to kind of riff off of. And one is, an exploration of what this might look like elsewhere. And you really delve into this when you spend some time in Rwanda. And I loved this because this is, to me, and I return to this, listeners will know I return to this all the time, David Graeber's idea that we have imagined this world and we could just as well reimagine another one. And I butcher that quote every time. But also that, so there's this piece of reimagining and looking at these sort of externalities, the places in which the cold chain has changed it. And we've looked a lot at that. Tomorrow, we're releasing an episode that explores a lot of NAFTA, and explores a lot of those sort of labor externalities. But also, and I want to bring this little piece in, that we have this connection to this other flesh. And you come back to this a lot, that this is alive flesh. It's respirating. It is metabolizing. And this reflection of that. And you even talk to the designer whose name I meant to write down about what would happen if we could better see our food, if it wasn't tucked behind these metal doors, and how that might connect. So I'll stop talking.
So, first of all, I 100% agree. I mean, I love that Graeber quote. And one of the things that I loved where you started this conversation with the idea that this is really recent, because to me, that helps with the reimagining. We haven't lived like this for very long. We don't have to carry on living like this. And I love the fact that the early experts didn't think refrigeration was a solution, because now there's this mantra that the cold chain is the solution. And I just think, why would we shut ourselves down that way? Maybe it is the best thing for certain foods, and maybe it's not for certain others. And one of the things I sort of say at the end of the book is, when you have a hammer, everything looks like a nail.
Yeah.
Cold can preserve a lot of things. Is it the best at preserving all the things? It is not. And does it have these externalities in terms of the environmental impact, in terms of the flavor and health of our foods, and all of the ways I trace throughout the book? Yes, it does. So we're not locked, we're not wedded eternally to cold. And one of the reasons why I'm so excited this book is coming out now, and that I really feel like it's actually important, is that we are at a moment where people are building cold chain like there is no tomorrow. You might think, how is that possible? We already have a cold chain in the US. It is the hottest. I mean, I'll tell you, if you're a real estate investor, it's a very hot market right now.
Fascinating.
It is growing rapidly in the US. And let's just look at the developing world, for want of a better term, where in many places there is no cold chain or a very limited one. And the country I visit in the book is Rwanda. And there's this sense that is sort of held up by, various UN, World Food Program, the international philanthropists who fund this kind of thing, World Bank, Bill Gates, all of these people, that cold chain is going to solve a lot of the sustainable development goals. It's going to prevent food waste. It's going to improve health and prevent malnutrition. It's going to free up women to be in the workforce. It's going to solve all the problems. And I think if we build a cold chain that is a mirror of our cold chain here in the rest of the world, that is a gigantic disaster in climate terms. I mean,
Yes.
just we haven't really talked about this, but this is,
Please touch on it, because this is important.
It is so energy hungry. Cooling already uses 10% of our global energy demand. Assuming that we can build a cold chain for 9 billion people, even assuming that we can have the renewable energy to run that, which is not there. The energy demand question is not solved. And then the refrigerants themselves. This is the number one solution identified by Project Drawdown to tackling global warming, the biggest impact solution.
Yes.
And so
because of and I have to throw one little thing at you, and then I'll let you continue. Project Drawdown talks about ammonia being a viable alternative and having a very low climate impact, but being smelly. And I find this fascinating, especially because I've also been looking at the way urine can be repurposed as nitrogen fertilizer. And I just think, I don't know, I think there's something there. And I think it's really interesting.
Well, so the question, refrigerants are, I look at this in the book. It's a really weird and interesting story how we came to what we have. And actually, Midgley, yeah, the one man environmental disaster.
Yeah.
This is the guy who introduced lead in petrol and CFCs, which I was a kid when the ozone layer was being destroyed and needed to be saved. And so I definitely don't remember really understanding the gravity of the situation. But it was, so CFCs were these amazing, non-toxic, perfectly safe, non-flammable refrigerants that were Midgley's, gift to the world. And they turned out to be destroying the ozone layer. And it was far more dicey than I think. I mean, certainly than I realized when I was a kid. The ozone layer was being destroyed at this incredibly rapid rate. It's irreplaceable, and without it, the surface of the Earth would be sterilized. So you can imagine what that does. Sterilized means there isn't life. I mean, so it was really this, and oftentimes the agreement signed to the Montreal Protocol, signed to sort of phase down CFCs, is cited as this great environmental moment where everyone agreed to do something. I think because it was such a gigantic disaster in the making. I mean, that was a moment where people were truly afraid. The Kigali Amendment to that, named after the capital of Rwanda where it was signed, is because the refrigerants that were introduced after CFCs as a replacement for CFCs turn out to be these have this huge global warming potential. So that's how a molecule's greenhouse gas effect is measured. Carbon dioxide is sort of the baseline, and then you get to many thousands times more global warming potential than carbon dioxide, and that's where these HFCs and HCFCs are. And they need to be phased out. But in many cases, they're not being phased out. Even in the US, that's a very difficult process, let alone in other countries with fewer resources. Anyway, this was all a long version of me saying we can't build the same cold chain in the rest of the world, or else we're all cooked. And I mean, literally. And yet we are not reimagining it. And this is where my call to action is at the end of the book, is like, let's have some nuance here. Maybe there are things we need cold for, and we can develop some much more sustainable, climate-friendly cold technologies, which are being done all the time. I mean, there's work being done with ice, just to go back full circle. You can freeze sort of pallets at night and use them to keep food cold during the day. I mean, we can just be a lot smarter about how we use cold. It's been sort of this unlimited thing in our Western version of it, and it shouldn't be, because it can't be. But also, not everything has to be chilled. And some of the things that, some of that is understanding how to store our food better. That works on every level. The South Korean designer I talk about in the book, Jiun Ryu, does this amazing work thinking about, it's called Save Food from the Fridge. And it builds on this idea that I mentioned, that a lot of produce doesn't actually like the conditions of the fridge. That is not the best conditions to store it in. And so her thing is like, if we understood these fruits and vegetables for what they are, these, as you say, respiring, metabolizing, organic
life
matter,
yeah,
life.
It's life.
Then we could build storage that suited it better. And she has these beautiful prototypes that have the side benefit. So they store your food better, in better condition, with more of its nutrients intact. And that's the other thing. People think of the fridge as this sort of like, it's almost like a bank vault. Like you put something in there and it is safe. It is losing. You put a bag of spinach in there, in a week's time, it will have half the amount of vitamins in there. And people, so it's not like a bank. It's not keeping your money for you.
You blew my mind. You had a quote to the extent of, we originally, and a lot of refrigeration was invented to keep foods fresh, but then refrigeration became what we associate with freshness. And so that really unlocked something for me. And you illustrate it with soy milk really beautifully.
Oh, the soy milk story is nuts.
It's nuts.
I mean, that's but just to finish my thought on this, the idea was that we could have, if we had these her sort of food storage designs, they also make our food more visible, and we can see it. We see that it's organic matter. We see it literally, the way that your head of lettuce will get sort of hidden under something in your fridge and you won't discover it until it's rotted. That wouldn't happen with her system. And that hers is a sort of deliberate design provocation, but I think what it points at is, if we could think about what actually needs to be cold and what doesn't, and how we might design a food supply chain that actually preserves food in a way that preserves its nutrients, that preserves its flavor, and that only preserves it to the extent that those things can also be preserved, rather than just saying maximum shelf life is best, we might design a food system that both puts us back in touch with where our food comes from, how it's grown, what it actually is, gives us a tastier food supply, potentially a healthier one, but also reduces food waste, which is the other huge climate change problem. And, everyone is like, oh gosh, refrigeration reduces food waste. What actually happens is it just changes where it happens. So prior to cold chain being introduced, a lot of food gets brought to market. It doesn't make it. It doesn't make it all the way there. And again, it's just to go back to where we started. It's because the people are in the cities and the food is having to come to them.
Yeah.
But that's where the food waste was happening before. And you can see this literally happen in real time as countries refrigerate. So China is a place I visit in the book, because China built a cold chain almost overnight. They did it in this very Chinese way, which was like the 11th 12-year plan. And they decided they were going to build a cold chain and modernize, and did it. And so you can see, in a way that, we're now 100 years forward from the US building a cold chain, so it's harder to see. In China, you can see it happen in real time. And all that happened is where the food was wasted has changed. Now it gets wasted at the supermarkets, in the restaurants, and in the homes. Before, it got wasted on the farms and on the way to, in the markets, on the way to the markets. And the same amount gets wasted. Refrigeration actually hasn't saved any food. It's
40%.
just changed where
and that number is
where it takes
40%.
place.
And I think
It's
this is
huge.
some of Jevon's paradox too. I wonder if more food has been wasted in some ways with the advent of refrigeration, trying to save us from wasting more, and that kind of tension
Well,
there.
I think it's the people who grow it, they don't want to see it wasted, and they've developed ways to not see it wasted. The people, in so doing, they have divorced the people who consume it from the value of that food and from an understanding of it as organic matter. And then that means is that we waste it.
Yeah.
And so it's an unfortunate, even there's an amazing post-harvest physiologist. So that means she works on, the physiology of, she's like a life extension guru for fruits and vegetables. Called Natalia Falagan, who I talked to in the book. She's the one who, when I went, she's like, they're alive. And her side project, she works on extending the shelf life of blueberries and how do you refrigerate them so that they, they last longer, etc. Her side project is one that is about, it's called Urban Revolution, and having people grow fruits and vegetables, and not in that way of like, oh, we're all going to feed ourselves from our urban gardens, but in a way that says, if we understand what it takes to grow this, when it's in season, how it lived when it was in the ground, which, remember, once you take it out of the ground, you're trying to stop it dying. So you're trying to recreate those conditions to the maximum extent. She's like, her and her collaborators on this project was, if people understood that, they would waste less and eat more of these vegetables. And it has proven true. And I think that's, urban farming gets all this, people who are like, oh, it's so impractical. That's not how we're going to feed the world. Well, we could feed the world out of our food waste right now. And if urban farming helps us waste less food and change our relationship to that food so that we waste less food, then hey, maybe urban farming is not so impractical after all.
Yes. I mean, I think that so much of this to come down to fostering a connection between our food.
Totally. Exactly.
that's the
Rebuilding that
piece.
relationship. Yeah.
Rebuilding that relationship and having the desire to reimagine it. And so I was so grateful for the way that you brought that piece around.
Well, thank you. I mean, it really is like, it's our primary relationship with the earth.
Yes.
Is feeding ourselves. And yet the way we do it now is not connected to the earth at all. And I'm not some, hippy dippy, we all have to go back to the land person. I love cities. I live in a city.
Yeah.
I also say strongly that we have to reimagine our food system. And this lens of refrigeration has proven a really useful one to see where our current system has sort of been broken.
Yes. I mean, I think that's a beautiful place to land it, because and longtime listeners know that I think that we have an intimacy with our food, a relationship with our food, and I just think that this was the most illuminating book. It absolutely tickled me. I flew through it. I was desperate to get my hands on it. Poor Julie had to endure many of my emails because I feel so passionately about this, and you just knocked it out of the park. And so I want to point everybody at the book, at Frostbite. You find our tagline here: How Refrigeration Changed Our Food, Our Planet, and Ourselves. And Nikki, it's been a pleasure. I'm sorry if I talked over you. I was just so excited about this. And so we didn't even touch on all these different pieces, but I hope people will go to the book to find them.
Yeah, I was going to apologize because I'm like, once I start on this topic, it is very hard to stop me. And so I thank you for giving me the space to sort of talk about this a lot, and for being, I mean, you're my dream reader in that you and your audience too clearly cares about this in a thoughtful and nuanced way. You know, my fear with a book like this is people are like, oh, well, is it good or bad? And it's just like, no,
it's complex.
Yeah, exactly. And that is what makes it powerful.
Yes.
And so, yeah, I really am. And yet at the same time, I hope also as like just fascinating. Like now we understand this. I certainly writing this just understood our food system in a completely different way. And so, yeah.
You know, you do something really beautifully, and I did want to say this because I was reflecting that I didn't really love history when I was in school, but I love history when it's anchored to something that I'm passionate about or I'm interested in. And I think what you've done with Gastropod as well as Frostbite is to find those anchors that open up the doors of curiosity, because you never know how shrimp is going to dovetail into child labor laws or that these pieces are going to be present. And so you do such a good job of opening up that curiosity, and Frostbite is no different.
Well, thank you. I mean, yeah, I'm the same as you. I can't get into history or science just for the sake of it. I have to be trying to answer a question and trying to understand a thing. And I, again, I'm a food person, so going in through food is the way for me. But yeah, thank you.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think we're all food people at heart. And thank you. The book comes out on June 25th, which I think is when this podcast will also release. And we'll have everywhere to find you in the show notes, links to Gastropod, links to the book, and any social media as well.
Absolutely. I'm so excited for people to read it and tell me their thoughts. And I'm sure there are more ways in which refrigeration has transformed things that I haven't thought of. So if people have things they want to say, my email address is easy to find.
Great. I love that. Nikki, I can't thank you enough for writing this book. I'm so excited. I'm going to be screaming it from the mountaintop. So thank you for talking to me. It really means a lot.
This was a really fun conversation. Thank you.
Thank you.
All right.
Thank you so much for listening to this episode of the Mind, Body, and Soil podcast. If what you found resonated with you, may I ask that you share it with your friends or leave us a rating and review wherever you listen to podcasts? This act of reciprocity helps others find Mind, Body, and Soil. If you're looking for more, you can find us at groundworkcollective.com and at Kate_Kavanaugh, that's KATE_KAVANAUGH on Instagram. I would like to give a very special thank you to China and Seth Kent of the band All Right for the clips from their beautiful song Over the Edge from their album The Crucible. You can find them at All Right on Instagram and wherever you listen to music.